if you want. All right, so while I'm converting things to symbols, the name is now going to matter a little bit more. Not so much the symbol name, but there's this little advanced arrow I can twirl down and get these other options. So the name, as I type it in, I'm going to call this plate. Now you will notice that I capitalized the name of my symbol. The reason being is when I'm working in Flash, I'm going to click on the Export for ActionScript button. It's now going to assign a class to this. Now that's not that important until you get into doing more advanced programming kinds of things, but it is going to come into play for some of the things we will want to do, because we're going to be putting objects in our library and then calling them to the stage through the magic of code, and then animating them, manipulating them, and controlling them all through simple programming. So we need to be able to identify the object. So I'm calling this object plate, and my other object I am going to title cake, again with a capital letter. Now, do I have to use a capital letter? Absolutely not. But when it assigns in this class name, it is important that the name it puts in is going to, it has to follow certain naming conventions. Tradition holds that the name is going to, of all classes, begins with a capital letter. That's a programming convention for ActionScript and other ECMAScript languages like JavaScript and Python. So that's tradition. If you don't use a capital letter, it's not a big deal, but what it does mean is if you use capital letters for anything that's going to ultimately be used as a class name, it actually makes your life easier when you try to look at someone else's code, when you find code examples online, when you ask for assistance in debugging your code on your projects, which all of you will at some point. If you follow some of these conventions, it just makes life nicer for all of us. So it's not a requirement, but it's nice now. And I'm going to just cancel that and do it again. If you notice it's a symbol 1 right now, if I click Export for ActionScript, it now got rid of the space and put that in. If I cancel again, hit F8, call this Fred is cool. So 3 words with spaces, you'll see that now when it puts it in, it got rid of those spaces because spaces aren't allowed in class names. So the convention is to use something that begins with a capital letter, and if you use multiple words, now if I try Fred is cool, like this, now click Export for ActionScript, you will see that now those capitals allow me to read it a little bit easier. This is referred to as camel case, where each word starts with a capital letter so you can read them. So there's certain things that when it comes to doing coding and programming that are conventions we follow to make the code easier to understand down the road. So do you have to name your symbol with a capital letter? Do you have to, when you check the Export for ActionScript box, make sure the class has a capital letter? No. But if you want me or someone else to read your code later on, it's going to make everybody's life a lot easier if you start applying and using these conventions. So cake with a capital C. Export for ActionScript, it now knows that. I hit OK. Now I do want to save this, because then I will be putting the file online at some future date. So now that I have these objects here, I have my plate, I have my cake, so I can have my cake and eat it too. You know, we might have to resurrect Celery Man a little bit later, but at least now I have this going on. So I would like for you to make a symbol or two that you can work with. They don't have to be a cake and a plate. They can be whatever names you want, but it's useful to, create those objects. So if you haven't started doing so already, go ahead and make those objects so that you can follow along. So I have my cake, I have my plate. I can move them around as I see fit. Now, these objects I don't need anymore because they currently reside in my library, So I can take the objects, delete them off the stage. I see them in my library. And there's a new column here that we may not have seen before called linkage. So we'll be able to work with that momentarily. So we're going to mash together a whole variety of different topics and concepts related to working with objects and programming in Flash. So again, if I want this object on screen, I can put it on screen. If I want to be able to control an object, it needs to have a variable instance name. Now, if you look in the Properties palette, you will see that there is a box called Instance Name up there. So in that box, I can give this object, this plate, an instance name. Now, I can just refer to this object as plate. Now, if you notice, this name, this instance I did, plate, is different than its linkage or symbol name. Do you see the difference? Look here. Now look in the other window. Do you see a difference between those? What is the difference? Lowercase for the instance name. Again, a programming convention, instance names, variable instance names are begun with a lowercase letter. That is a convention that we choose to adhere to. So this is called plate. Now, when I'm putting code into my project, it's always recommended to put my code onto its own layer. If I use the code snippets in Flash, it will automatically add an actions layer for me and start putting the code onto that layer. Well, we are not going to use the snippets panel. We're going to do it ourselves tonight. So I will double click in my layer name. I'm going to call this actions. And now I can do whatever I want in my actions. So I can get to what actions by choosing Option F9 on Mac, F9 on the Windows, or going under Window, pull down, and choosing actions. All of those are viable ways to do it. When you first pull it up, it probably looks something like this, where you have the left-hand column showing you all of the top-level classes. We don't need that for the purposes of what we're doing. We just need to pull it up. So I can collapse that column by clicking on the little triangle. That gets rid of it. Now it's waiting for me to type some code. So what I could do very easily is I could just say plate dot x equals, and now what do you think I need to follow that by? What type of character or characters?
Number.
A number. Very good. X is referring to my X position of the object as it shows up in my Properties panel. So if we look in the click on the object, look in the Properties panel, everything that we see over here, my X, my Y, my width, my height, my color effects, all of these things are actually controllable through code. So all the properties of an object that show up in the Properties panel can all be manipulated through code. Now some of them are a little more involved than others. Like if I want to use a filter, there's a whole kind of process I have to go through to be able to apply, say, a blur filter or glow filter to an object. So it's not as simple as just saying object.blur x equals blah, blah, blah. It's more involved, but it should be that easy, but it's not. But x and y, width and height, these are all things I can manipulate quite handily. So I click on my code. Now notice I click on the object, go to actions, it comes up and tells me that I can't put code directly in objects. Well, that object was selected, so I can't put the code onto it. I need to choose my actions in my frame layer, and you notice that it now has a little A in it down here, indicating there is code on that frame. So I can click there, go to my actions. Now if I wanted, so every time I go to the actions panel, that I don't have to click on that frame, so I can click on objects and do other things, there's this little pin down here at the bottom where I can say pin this script. And what that means is I can click wherever I want, click on whatever object I want. I could even have more objects on screen. I could have other plates on screen. Could have a piece of cake on screen. And no matter what's active, I go here and it still shows me that code. So that's accomplished by pinning or unpinning this script. Click on the frame, go to my actions, pin it, now it will stay active. So I like to do that when I'm working with code in the timeline, because then I don't have to hunt for it at a future point. So I pin the scripts, and you always have to then pay attention, because I'll routinely then pin like 4 or 5 different scripts at different points in the project. So I will have to look and say actions, colon, and then the number there is what frame that script is from. Is it from frame 1, frame 50, frame 100, frame 1000? So you need to pay attention to what number is showing up there. So plate X equals 0. Now we punctuate the end of a line of code with a semicolon. That is what Flash wants you to do. Generally, if you don't do it, when you tell Flash to auto-format your code, it will do it for you. If you have errors in your code, then it will get wonky as it tries to put in the semicolons. But it generally wants you to do it. So if you don't put in the semicolons, no one's going to cry, but it makes your life easier if you do. So I'd encourage you to do that. So now, if I save this and run this movie, we'll see that if we compare these two movies, the one on stage and the one that I just loaded, what's the difference that we see happening here? Did the named plate move? But only the named plate move. Not all the plates. The other plates don't have names yet. So I could call this one plate 2. And I can call this other one plate 3. And to make it a little bit easier on myself, I'm going to then rename this one as plate 1. Now if I go into my actions and if I save this and try and run it now, I'm going to get an error message because it says, hey, we can't find a property of something called plate because there is no object called plate now. So I can close the Swift that open, and so it gives me this error message down in my compiler errors window. Double click on that, it highlights the line of code. So if I have 1,000 lines of code, it will tell me the line of code that it thinks the error's in. So it will then go to that. So if I change this to, say, plate 1 and run it, no errors, and we can see it again then did move over. So far, not terribly exciting, but I can now take this line of code and so plate 1 is the original plate. I renamed it. Now, let's see, I think I copied that. No, I didn't. So I'm going to copy that line of code. While you're doing coding, it's not uncommon to do quite a bit of copy pasting. You just have to make sure that you then make things correct as you do so. So if I just leave it like this, plate 1, 2, and 3 x equals 0, we can see their starting points are way over here. If I run this, they all now move themselves over. They behave because they have names, and then they will follow whatever directions I give them through code. So I've now positioned them through code. Now if I give my cake a name, I could move that over as well and position that where I wanted to. I could even, through code, position the cake on the plate. So if I were to instead change these to maybe 100, let's see, I have not given that a name yet. I'm only going to have one cake tonight, so we'll put that as is. And we can see that the cake's almost in the middle of the plate. So if I had guessed better on my math, I could have put it right in the middle. We can test it again. No, it's not too bad. And now at this point, let's see, so that sits there. So we're going to have a stack of 3 plates, and I will be putting the cake on it. Because not only can I modify my X, I can also modify my Y value. And I'm going to guess it's probably going to be about 160. Nope. Way too low. Whoops, I was queuing off the wrong part of the cake here. There we go. So now we have the cake sitting on top of the 3 plates. Things have been repositioned through the magic of code. But just moving things around isn't always the most exciting thing. Sometimes it's fun to actually see them animate over time. And that's what we're going to do next.